There's another encounter that Abraham has with God that reveals something of God's character to us. Remember that Abraham was promised this child. Well, God changed Abraham's name to Abraham, representing this sense of a man of faith that could be trusted the father of many nations. And sure enough, along the way, Isaac is born. Isaac is the child of the promise that God had given. What we need to remember is that Abraham and Sarah were both past childbearing age. And they tried to make God's promise happen through their own plans, but God was faithful to his man of faith. Sometimes it's easy to follow God when the sun is shining. You know, when we understand what's happening, when we understand the plan, when we can control our environment, we can control situations. In other words, when things are going well and we're living in blessing, it's very easy to trust God and to follow God. But sometimes life isn't like that. Sometimes life is hard and we face trials because we live in a messy, mucky world. We live in a sinful world that often doesn't want to go the way that God wants us to go. And it's a lot harder to follow God when we don't understand, when things are going hard, when we can't fix things, when we face problems, when we feel powerless. It becomes a lot harder to trust God. And in Genesis 22, we come to this incredible encounter that God has with Abraham, where Abraham's living in blessing. Everything's going really well. He's got the child that he's always wanted. The promise has been given to him. And at this point, God steps in and we see Abraham being tested. There are moments where we have this mountaintop experience of faith, and Abraham's had that. And he's also had his moments of crisis and failure. And we've had moments where Abraham's tried to fix things himself. And when we come to chapter 22, what we see is God saying, okay, Abraham, I want to see what you've learned. I want to see what you're made of. So Isaac represents this promise of God. And at this point, all of Abraham's hopes and dreams, his future, the promises that he's had from God, everything is invested in Isaac. Isaac means everything to him. He's the most precious thing that Abraham has. And if you remember in the Ten Commandments, one of the first things that God says is, you shall have no other God before me. And if God is our King, our Sovereign, our Adonai, the question that he asks of Abraham and he asks of us is, will we put anything before God? Is there anything that we would hold back? Will we follow him wholeheartedly? To our 21st century minds, this passage is a bit difficult to understand because we look at it and read it and sort of say any God who asks someone to sacrifice a child is just abhorrent, it's just horrid. But let's not forget that one of the reasons God promised the land he did to Abraham was because the people in that land were sacrificing their children. It was a common practice at the time and God hated it. What we've got going on here, though, is not about the child sacrifice. It's actually a question that God's posing to Abraham. Would you be willing to sacrifice your only son for your relationship with me? And we see Abraham as he goes on this journey with Isaac. In verse 8 of chapter 22, we read Abraham say to his son, God will provide the ram. And at the last moment, sure enough, God comes through. It's in this context of God coming through that we see this next identity of God revealed, and that is of Jehovah Jireh, the God who will provide. And what we see in this encounter is, yes, okay, it's God coming through at the last minute, and doesn't it always seem to be that way? Doesn't it always seem to be that God comes through at the last minute? But there's a couple of key things here where Abraham trusts God and says God will provide. And in verse 12, God says, now I know you truly fear me. In other words, you truly love me, you truly trust me, you truly follow me. Abraham responds to Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. And we see in this story where God provides a substitute himself for Abraham. Abraham was willing to give up his only son for the relationship with God. And then we see this forerunner of Jesus where God himself substitutes in place of the human in order that the relationship can be whole. God gives up his only son, his own son, and God comes through and provides what we need. And I wonder, have you ever responded to that for yourself? Have you ever realised just how amazing it is that God would want to step in and be the God who provides that we might have the relationship with him?